right, welcome everybody. We're live. My name is John Buck. I'm here with the Bevry community here to discuss John Vervaeke's 48th lecture now of Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. I'm joined today, at least on camera, with Brett, and then off camera we have both, well actually three people, and I don't know, we might have another come in later perhaps, but we've got Nick. Go ahead, say something so people know your voice.
Hi.
Yeah, there you go.
That was good.
And we've got Craig Reed.
Hello.
And we've also got Delric, or Struan, first time joiner for these conversations, but he's actually the one that introduced John Vervaeke to Paul Vanderklay and sort of got probably most of us into that sort of bubble now because of you. So thank you very much, Struan. Now you have to say something, man. Oh well. Are you? It seems like you're speaking, but I think your mic is muted on your end. All right. Well, this is bad radio, so we're gonna move forward.
Can you hear me now?
Yep. There you go.
Okay. Okay. So my microphone switch is acting up. Sorry about that.
Oh yeah. No, that's all right. All right.
Yeah.
So
hi, everyone.
Yeah, there you go. And by the way, we should thank you again for introducing Vanderklay to Vervaeke's work, because I think it was through him that I came to find Vervaeke. So
yeah, I'm a real mimetic virus.
yeah, there you go. All right, so I know one of the things that we wanted to like put higher on our agenda for today, even though it was kind of like touched on at the end of episode 47, he goes into it a little bit further. With Heidegger in this episode 48, where Heidegger's position is that the conceptualization of being as just the utmost limit to what beings are, as sort of like a supreme being, is what keeps us in sort of this having mode of, I guess, our ontology, or how we think about the world, which puts us into a slippery slope, I guess you could say, towards nihilism by interacting with the world in that sort of having way. And I know he goes into this quite often, but the sort of distinctions between there's having mode and being mode, where having mode is more like static and propositional, where things have some sort of like ultimate status to the, or not ultimate status, but like a objective, I guess, status to them that's unchanging in a sense. And then being mode is where you're undergoing experiences that can sort of transform you into like a different person, or to grow out of it in some way. And that's very much in a participatory fashion, that you're in a, I guess, sort of like a relationship with being. And that's the thing, like being from Heidegger is like the capital B being, which means like all of phenomenal. I don't even know if I can say it quite like that, but it has to do with like our phenomenal experience of reality. But I'm sure there's more to Dasein than just that. But anyway, so if we wanted to like, I guess, kind of move on, or kind of discuss that exact topic, because it's like Vervaeke is sort of like throwing down quite the hammer there via Heidegger in saying that all of theism as a worldview is something that leads a person into a state of nihilism, because they're experiencing reality in like the complete incorrect way, in this having mode.
I think classical theism is an important tag there, rather than the more generalized theism.
Well, yeah, I mean, he seems to be putting classical theism at the heart of the meaning crisis here, which was surprising, since a lot of the rest. Well, I mean, he had a bit of this in. See, I knew he was blaming sort of Protestantism, for the meaning crisis, or at least in part. But now he seems to be going a lot broader, in that the very just classical concept, or even I guess the Christian concept of God, is at the heart of this being mode. He said, for Heidegger, this is the ultimate modal confusion. This is to turn being into a problem that can be solved by the conceptual manipulation of a propositional defined object, i.e. classical theism's traditional presentation of God. So like that's I was like, bam.
Yeah.
And again, I'd be careful with our framing. Classical theism, it comes down to a handful of people. I don't think it is in any way fundamental to Christianity.
Right. So the distinction,
I would argue the opposite.
So the distinction you're sort of making
totally.
there is the philosophical conception of God as sort of this, actually thinking of God as a being of some sort with certain properties in a sort of like objective, I guess, propositional way, in a way that.
I mean, it's the one of the commandments: don't make an idol, right? So classical theism forms God into an idol, and then reshapes the religion around the idol of God, and that doesn't work.
Just to clarify, how do you distinguish classical theism from as you see Christian theism?
Well, like for example, it's one of the 10 commandments not to make an idol out of God. Also,
I thought
a lot of what he brings in
was the omni God. I thought that's what classical theism was.
I think classical theism is the classical philosophical God, where God is regarded as omnibenevolent, omnipotent, and omniscient. But it's also like it's the idea that God is fixed and unchanging. Like God is the unconditioned, etc., etc., etc. But like the static nature of God, the ever unchanging, the eternal dimension is highly important.
And deeply honestly, propositionally defined.
But I hear Christians, at least online, describing God like that quite a bit.
Can I interject two things?
Yeah.
It's interesting because the whole trajectory of John Vervaeke's work, the criticism implicit for the meaning crisis, is against secularism. He never specifically says this was one of the downsides of secularism, but that's implicit. The criticism of the meaning crisis is the secularization of society.
No, to be fair, he does criticize. Just to interrupt and let you get back. He does criticize secularism for that. He does say
he may say it a few times, but the whole trajectory of his work is a criticism of what secularization has done to the way we think. It's really part and parcel of it. Classical theism, the way it's being used, it was kind of a response to secularism. So you talk about the attributes of God as a way for like me, an apologist or philosopher, to answer the challenge laid down by the secular person. Well, God is, and so now I have the attributes of God. I can define God philosophically, logically, consistently. Like it was a response. So when you hear some people, I mean, that's debatable.
Nowadays, it definitely is. I think there is a good argument to be made that it developed.
I think it first appeared in Thomism, maybe. I mean, he started with trying to define the attributes of God and standardize it and make it logically coherent and philosophical. And so that was part of his project. And then some of what people like William Lane Craig today, when he talks about classical theism and the attributes of God, he agrees with some of the Thomist ideas and then some of the other ideas that have come up. But my understanding of how it's developed is sort of, I don't know, maybe he disagrees. What would you say? You were going to say something different?
Me?
Yes.
Oh, I agreed with what you were saying there. Yeah, okay. I was just saying, I think we could trace it further back than the recent, say, more immediate response to secularization.
I mean, it goes back to Plato and Aristotle.
Yeah, in many ways, it falls down on Paul by combining, the Greek philosophical thought with Christian thought.
Yeah, and Augustine is very heavy in that kind of thinking as well.
Yeah.
Well, the only thing that's modern is like people have used classical theism now as an apologetic. So to standardize your conception of God and define this being God in a way that's logical, philosophical, consistent, Aquinas did that too. And that's kind of where I think that's where it first appeared in Christianity. I'm not sure if that's true. Maybe what's his face before did it too, but I don't know.
So it's more than just an idol, right? It's a way of describing God in propositional terms, it seems.
I'd actually like to hijack the conversation at this point and point out that in Christianity, the book of John begins with, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. But if you take the idea that that God is the Word, or that the Word is God seriously, then it implies that you're living in service of the Word. And the thing is that with civilization, ultimately, we're all living in service of the Word. It's like civilization is basically the art of the Word. Like that's what we're all practicing in like what we're doing right now.
And you would say that would be a more being approach, right?
Well, this is the thing, is like we're ultimately responsible for the way that we construct our words. So the idol that Nicholas was talking about, we don't have a choice but to construct some sort of idol, because we have to worship in order to serve something. And so we have this idea that we have to look at. So that's the classical theism idea ultimately is this attempt to construct this idea that people can relate to conceptually in order to live by it, because that's the word is basically what they have to live, to abide by.
Right. And I guess there could be like certain criticisms of sort of that classical theistic conception, just that it's not very effective at allowing people to be able to relate to it. Like, how do you relate to something that is like
that's where the nihilism ultimately comes in.
Mm-hmm.
Because the way that the word, like the particular way that it was structured in Christianity, and the articulation, well, God is the truth, and so on and so forth. Nietzsche makes the argument, that like it was well, if you remove the metaphysical presupposition of God, everything comes apart with it. But he said it failed precisely because Christianity claimed to be the truth, and it couldn't maintain that claim. If it didn't make that claim, Christianity would have survived without a problem. But it was because this entire edifice of the word, this idea that there was this eternal mind-independent thing that that didn't change. It wasn't actually immanent in the world itself. Like, as we developed this idea, we became more distant from it to the point where we could no longer relate to it. Like, Nietzsche has a wonderful line where he says, well, if we don't know God, how can we be obligated towards something that we don't know? And so that's like the secularism and the meaning crisis is now, it's ultimately a nominalism, because we don't believe in our words anymore.
But he also described. Sorry, go ahead. No, go ahead.
Yeah, no. I was going to just say that I'm not sure I entirely agree with Vervaeke on the point that, like, I don't think the solution to the meaning crisis is to poo-poo the propositional knowledge system. I think we actually have to rehabilitate it. We can't just neglect it. Like our problem is that the system is broken.
Right. I would say that the propositional level has a very strong function to it, in that it allows social cohesion to occur, and like there's an ability for me to speak and for you to understand, and then we can kind of move forward from there. Like, I can like issue you instructions that you can put those instructions into form, and then we can sort of like work together in tandem with each other. And I think
we don't have to beat each other into submission.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that the biblical story of the Tower of Babel is exactly kind of like a symbol of what happens when a society's I guess relationship with the word fails. Like, people will start to hold to differing definitions for within their own groups, and then there's sort of this inability to communicate with each other, and where there are not words to speak, all we have left are our fists. I mean, that's kind of like
that's exactly the problem.
Well, see, so Vervaeke doesn't say get rid of the propositional or rehabilitate the propositional. I think what he says is we've forgotten the other types. We've forgotten the being mode.
That's what I agree.
I agree with that.
So for example, for a debate, if all you're doing is arguing over propositions, there's nothing transformative necessarily about that. That if we don't have the being mode aspect, the participatory, the perceptive, perceptual, and
so there's propositional, procedural, participatory, and perspectival. Yeah.
Right. So
well,
go ahead.
I just want to push back on that a little bit because, as I said, I think it's the fact that we are responsible for the way that we construct our words that is at issue. Like we have to talk that out. We can't avoid it. That is where our that part of what is broken down is what has led to the meaning crisis, specifically because
but I think it's more than just construction of words. Like Vervaeke often talks about the manipulation of propositions. So if all we're doing is manipulating propositions, then,
that's
for example, we're not really
right. That's sophistry.
If that's all we're doing, say, and I think he says a lot of these online debates are basically that. We're not, say, like I've added, one of the things I've tried to add in my sort of method of having better discussions online is to put yourself in the other person's shoes. And that's something that's more than, I think that's bringing in some being mode. Like it's communicating in a more participatory way, putting yourself in the perspective of the other side.
So the question is, what is the action you're carrying out in service to? And this is perhaps to Nietzsche's point about, right, the problem with Christianity is precisely that it called itself the truth. Right. So what ends up happening is that as we are having these discussions within the religion and across religious boundaries, what we end up focusing the conversation to be in service to truth. And this has the effect of actually isolating us away from the being mode. Whereas, say, for instance, yes.
Yeah, that's very good.
If you were, say, putting yourself in the position where the fundamental goal was connection with the person you were talking to, right? Communication, the ability to understand their perspective and to have your perspective understood, that's going to end up with a really different type of conversation than one that imagines itself purely in service to truth.
Right. And my if I would generalize the meaning crisis, it isn't that Vervaeke wants to do away with propositional type knowledge. It's that we have tended to way overvalue it at the exclusion of other types of like participatory, of other types of engagement, including narrative, myth, and intuitives. And that's what's helped lead to the meaning crisis, because propositions without religion, spirituality, guidance are insufficient. That's what I think the meaning crisis is ultimately all about. And I think that classical theism is trying to plug Christianity into some of the same framing devices that were being used, not necessarily in error, just to try and show how it matches up with things that are philosophically true, scientifically true. Like Thomas Aquinas's goal was to make Christianity philosophically consistent, so that a philosopher can go, yes, this makes sense and that makes sense. You know what I'm saying? To logically fill it out.
But honestly, I think Vervaeke's statement goes further than even just classical theism, or tell me what you think. Because Vervaeke says at the end of 47 that Heidegger is right, that the long-standing tradition in which God is understood in the having mode as a supreme being that grounds and makes all other beings. I mean, this is as fundamental a definition of God as I think, matter what your whether it's classical or Christian or what, right? Like, sorry, go ahead.
Finish it. Finish the.
Well, yeah, he said this is a fundamental mistake. So it's a fundamental mistake to think of God as the supreme being that grounds and makes all other beings. But that,
he's an atheist after all. Remember, like, he's very sympathetic to theism until you get down to the actual underlying.
No, but that's what I was saying, though, is he's more than criticizing, I think, classical theism. I mean, you don't get any more basic as a definition of God as that which grounds and makes all other beings.
Yeah.
Right?
He's like, criticizing theism, period.
All of theism. Like it's not just classical theism, it's all of theism.
Yes, he's saying theism is a mistake that leads to nihilism. That's what I read that as. Theism in and of itself is a mistake that leads to nihilism.
And is he sort of getting at that from the existentialist perspective that like for every single, like I know within what is it, not Camus but the other Sartre, like man is the person that kind of creates their own meaning. Like that's the essence of man is that they have no essence, and so it's up to man in order to create
Existence
their own
precedes essence.
Yeah, exactly. And so if he's sort of following in that existentialist kind of framework, then similar to how like Vervaeke brings up the poem about the rose that has no why, I guess similar to that, each individual person, actually I don't even know if Heidegger accepts the individuality of personhood, but personhood is almost like a flourishing rose in itself, that it has no, I guess, external value judger for the being itself. To give it value.
That's almost 100% correct. Yeah, yes. I agree with everything you just said. That's like the person is existence precedes essence in existentialism. So you're born, then you figure out what to become. You create your own meaning. There's no intrinsic goal to your life. You weren't put here for a purpose. You weren't designed to be Beethoven, and now your meaning matches your theological construct, your divine will. It's just you chose. And
I find it a little obnoxious that he uses a rose as an example.
Yeah. It definitely is something that automatically has some sort of innate value to it, and so like it's already proceeding.
He's riding hard on the innate connotations we have of a flower. As
why didn't he just use an analogy like a fungus, a fungus that emerges out?
Why not the shit falling out of your ass? Right?
Yeah.
A little more coherent. Yeah.
I know Nick and Galric, you guys had a bit of a discussion on the forum about ontotheology, and so he brings up ontotheology. He says it's the problem of ontotheology, of trying to understand being ontologically in terms of a supreme being. Do you guys want to talk a little bit about what you've discovered about ontotheology and how it relates?
Well, I will try and connect it to what you guys have been saying, because I think Nick touched on a very good point where he said, he asked, why are we doing this? What's the goal? Because if we can't say what we're doing, then what are we bothering with in the first place? And that's the inaction of the nihilism, which is like really produces the meaning crisis. And so the ontotheology, as far as I can tell, you see, it's even if it's flawed, it's still an exposition of a goal. It's still an idea of something that you're trying to aim towards. And so I don't see how you can, if you're eschewing the idea of a purpose, I don't see how it is that you can actually speak meaningfully about how people are going to work together. Like.
First, what is ontotheology? Can you give a?
I think Nick's actually said it better, but the basic idea, as I understand it, is that you're conflating ontology and theology, so that you're worshiping being as well as the supreme being. But that, it doesn't really make sense to just say it like that.
Right. Yeah, I think I remember, Nick, you had a much, like, you were able to explain it quite well last conversation that we had.
The way I broke it down was the telos, I'll use that word just to get nice and triggery, of ontology is fundamentally this kind of inward dive into the mystery of being through our kind of direct experience of it. And likewise, the goal of theology was originally, and in many ways should be, this outward exploration into the mystery of existence. And that when we combine these two, we basically actually are removing the mystery by, in some sense, trying to balance them against each other.
Right. And so by merging them together, that's like what we consider metaphysics or something like that, where you're actually like referring to the mystery of theology in a sort of framework of propositions and ontology.
What you're basically doing in ontotheology is you're creating this structure, like you're saying everything that exists is being, and therefore everything that exists is explicable in terms of being. So it must be, you must be able to tie it to being. If you can't tie it to being, then it doesn't exist.
Right.
And so there's a like Parmenides, he started with the argument that being is one. Like he was the one who really began with monism, and if I remember correctly, Zeno's paradoxes were created because Zeno, who was a pupil of Parmenides, was actually trying to argue against change,
right?
Like in the world, because that was an illusion as far as Parmenides was concerned. But
because something can't come from nothing. And so, like, if there's a new state of events that happen, then it would be coming from something that where this state of events didn't occur.
And it's also like the idea that you Vervaeke said it somewhere, like you alluded to Parmenides saying thinking and being are the same. But if you actually go back and you check the Greek, the word that is used for same is auto, like automaton, or autopoetic, or autopoic, sorry. The implication being like the word self and the word same, that's both auto. Like the Greeks thought that it's actually ironic.
Just mean to exist? I mean, isn't that just tautological, like just definitional? That to be.
Yeah, but then the question is, what is existence? Existence doesn't actually say what existence is. It's just circular. So can you tell me what being or existence is in such a way?
Any definition is circular, right? Because it's any definition is done by comparing to other ways of saying.
I think what Delric's getting at is like to say that something, what being is or being exists, doesn't tell you if like being is multiple or if being is singular or if being is.
Well, what I'm trying to
get at is the state of not being nothing. I don't know. I'm using the word. Using the word being in it. The state of non-nothingness.
Well. Yeah, the whole nothingness thing with the Greeks is like a whole nother rabbit hole. But to just finish what I'm trying to say, you see, basically the idea that yourself is your likeness. It's what you are the same as. The itself, like that's your identity. Like being was regarded as the sameness, specifically the sameness. Like as opposed to, let's say, change. Becoming would be change. You can't being can't be becoming because sameness can't be changed, because if there's a change, there's a difference, and a difference is opposed to sameness. So this is like kind of what the logic that Parmenides was going through. So everything that is has to be one with the one, and that is the beginning of universalism. And ontotheology is basically the idea of forcing everything into this oneness. Like it's all part of that one universal totalitarian paradigm. And once you start looking at the world that way, you become unable to see anything outside of that framework.
Is that kind of like how you get the different Greek concept or philosophies of like all is fire, all is water, all is air, all is matter, all is atoms?
That's sort of the beginning of it, but you can imagine like, you see, Christianity is actually a good example of this, because then you create this idea of this eternal being that you are in service to, that defines everything in your life. And so everything, all of your words literally gets tied back to this one thing, because this one thing is now what is defined as being. And so it totalizes your thinking system, and that's the theological system.
A thing, or being is a state, right? Like being is a being isn't really an it. It's a descript, like an adjective.
Both. It's a noun
it depends. Yeah.
It's a noun and a verb.
Well, you can say you are a being, but we're not talking about being. Like when we say you are a being, we're not. That's a different use of the word being, as we're saying here. Like being.
But is it?
Right, but that's where it gets really like
a rock exists, but we don't usually call a rock a being, right?
Right, but that's where you get into complicated theological territory, because like when you first ask, who shall I say sent me? I am that I am. Some interpretations are I am that is being. I am being of its in and of itself. I am becoming. There's a whole different variation of interpretation of the answer, Yahweh, what Yahweh actually means. Go, Check it out sometime. Go look at all the different Hebrew.
Yeah, no, I
what
get
the
it in
Hebrew-
that sense. I wasn't taking that into account.
Well, this
I-
actually gets into
yeah.
the problem of universals, because, well, that's where realism as a term was first invented in the medieval age, because it was referred to the people who believed that there were universals outside the mind, and they weren't just names or whatever. But you see, so like the rock, you would say that a rock exists, but according to a realist of that sort, the rock would have a being, because there would be, let's say, for example, the eternal platonic form of a rock, and so that's the being of a rock.
Sure.
And so in that sense, you would speak of being.
But sorry, I'm just thinking, like, what would Heidegger say? Like, okay, the question of whether God exists is a question of fact. So, I guess I don't know much about Heidegger. Was he an atheist or?
Yeah, I thought so. Existentialist for sure. So my
Like,
guess is
but
yes.
what if
He was
Heidegger
against
realized?
metaphysics.
So what if Heidegger realized that God did exist and God did create everything? Then you can't say it is incorrect to say God is the supreme being who is the ground and created everything. Like that may be a metaphysical position, but it's also a question of fact. Like, is that the way things are built or not? So,
well,
whether
I don't know wrong, I don't even know if Heidegger would like accept that, like, we have to hold to these sorts of propositional statements as facts. Like, it may be that for the type of being that is a cow, they have to have models and conceptions of reality that are closely tuned to what it means to be a cow. In sort of the same way, for what it is to be a human, they have to have the same anthropocentric conception of reality, such that it works to the type of beings that we are.
Sorry, I'm not following though the relation to what if there is God who is the ground of all being.
Like, even if there was a God that did exist, but we had no words to comprehend it, then to say that God exists would be sort of a useless phrasing as a person, and rather, if to hold to a conception of reality that works better as a, I don't know, conception for a human, that would be something we ought to hold to instead.
The question is, how are you relating to whatever that is? So when we set it up as this thing exists, and right, we're framing in actually inherent in how we're describing it, we're actually framing our relationship to it.
Right, that's good, because Vervaeke brings up that distinction between ontic and ontology, where ontology is to do with, I guess, like the abstract maybe relations that things have with one another, sort of like within propositional relationships with logic or something like that. Whereas with ontic, as far as I understand it, it has to do with like how it relates to you as a being that exists, and like your experiences as a being that exists. Like, there are certain correlations between my getting up in the morning and the sun being out or something like that. That's some sort of like relation there that's purely phenomenal.
So is Heidegger criticizing the proposition of God as being, or just that we've also forgotten the being mode to add into that proposition, or to add into what we deal with that proposition?
That's really complicated. And I'm not, like, Vervaeke disagrees with Heidegger on this point, because he says that Heidegger accused Plato of obscuring the meaning of being, and Vervaeke says no, it's actually Aristotle. But I remember reading that Heidegger actually said it was Parmenides who first obscured the meaning of being. Sorry, what did you ask again?
Just is Heidegger or Vervaeke critiquing the proposition of being as the supreme being, or that just focusing on that proposition makes us forget the being mode of being, and focuses only on the propositional mode, the having mode?
I'm not sure if, like, Heidegger was trying to reclaim the meaning of being. Like, I very much got the impression that, like, he when he says we've forgotten it, he's dead serious. Like, we don't know what it means anymore, because he was. It goes back to the idea, like, he. I could actually get up a thing on the IEP, but basically he argues that being, it was totalizing. So every being is everything, but being is the thing that is independent. It can't be described in terms of anything else. So it's self-standing, and then it's taken as obvious and self-evident at the same time. And when you put all three of these things together, then you can no longer comprehend what you're thinking about. And but that's exactly what the move of what philosophy has done. And this is why we are no longer able to connect to being authentically.
Right. Okay. So that maybe helps me, because one of the things, like the questions I wanted to return to, was how does Heidegger's understanding of like the classical theistic conception of God, or even just theism in general, how does that lead to nihilism? And if it's the case that this sort of conception puts you into a position where you cannot relate to being itself in any sort of way at all, because it's something utterly foreign and alien to oneself, then I guess kind of see that connection.
Well, it's like the way that Gödel's incompleteness theorems proved themselves by creating a falsification. Like the incompleteness theorem proved that if you prove that the statements are complete, you're essentially proving this statement is false, and that's a contradiction. And so it's a self-contradiction. And so the nihilism comes in because you create the system, you think it's this complete thing. And then, but the construction of the complete thing creates this, let's say, the statement or whatever, that ultimately undermines the entire thing. And then when you get to the point where the entire thing is undermined, then you're left with nihilism, because you say, well, what was the point of all of this?
Yeah, you're chasing a ghost.
But that seems like it would be a critique of all metaphysics rather than just theistic ones. Because like if you hold that all of being is phenomenal, then that's a similar sort of
well, Heidegger was explicitly anti-metaphysical in his thinking. He was trying to get beyond metaphysics, especially if I remember correctly, his later works.
Also, what was the quote from Vervaeke? Because that's Vervaeke's argument that it does lead to nihilism, right? The quote that you read, Brett.
Yeah, I can try to.
Yeah, that would be good.
Because Vervaeke's version is a little different, but Vervaeke is arguing that theism leads to nihilism too. He just doesn't really go into it in any depth, right?
So here's what he says. He says, so ontotheology, it's the way of understanding being gets us into deep forgetfulness and modal confusion that is the hallmark of nihilism.
And then that's like all he really says on the, like he doesn't go further into it at all for the rest of it.
Yeah.
Well, he does get into it. Well, later on in the lecture, he says, so here's what he says later on in the lecture. So he was talking about that Corbyn was a deep opponent of fundamentalism and literalism. And he said he was seeing a potential way of seeing Heidegger's critique of ontotheology. We have the supreme being, and we have our propositions about this ultimate being. We can think the way in which we should be is to have these propositions in a fundamentalist, literalist fashion, then lose all of this. By this, he's talking about the imaginal. We haven't gotten into the imaginal yet, but he's talking about there's the subjective and the we gotta get
right.
His imaginal stuff.
Come back to that.
Yeah. So I guess sort of the concern here right now is that there is the dilemma within doing utterly away with metaphysics, in that it leaves us with a inability to communicate about being with each other. And that's the sort of utility to having propositions. And then there's the other side of that coin, that when we have this sort of metaphysics or ontotheology of being, then that puts us into a position where we cannot relate with it because it's something so foreign to our own selves and our limited
it has
space.
the tendency to totalize, and when it becomes totalizing, it becomes unknown to us. It's like the way, in order to have definition, you have to have contrast, and if you collapse everything into a totality, then you lose the contrast, and so then where's the definition? You can't form one, and then making the definition breaks the totality. Making the contrast breaks the totality.
When you say can't relate to it, you mean can't relate to being or can't relate to God?
Well, if you can't define it, you can't. If you don't know what you're dealing with, you're not relating to it.
Like, is he almost saying we're externalizing our being by putting it into the proposition of God, and therefore we almost forget our own being? Is that sort of what he's saying?
I think within your context, what he's saying is that we tend to create these ideas of what God is, and then as long as I've got the right words and the right beliefs and everything, I'm totally fine. Doesn't matter what else is wrong in my life, how miserable I'm feeling, you know, what kind of ways I'm addicted to self-destructive patterns of behavior and so on and so forth, because I've got the right propositions.
But see, I'm not a theist, but clearly, I mean, a lot of theists have a transformative relationship to God in terms of their agent in a relationship, like they see themselves as a servant of God or in the image of God.
The meaning crisis is far beyond just the religious believers. I mean, this is like the propositional, the tendency to absolutize the propositional system is very heavily within the secular as well. It's like,
but I'm
it's
saying
even worse there actually.
But I'm saying it seems incorrect to say that having that view of God makes theists forget some being relationship to God or a transformational relationship to God, because it seems like many have that. So that seems wrong.
It's actually a subtle, very, very subtle argument against God, because you're kind of saying it's nihilistic because it cannot be. What you just said is something that you've heard Christians say, and you kind of believe that they have it. He's kind of saying
it's an argument against putting God into words.
Yeah, but likewise, what you were saying, go ahead, Nick. Sorry.
I was just going to say it. I don't think we actually have to have a definition of something to relate to it. Otherwise, right, there would have been nowhere for definitions to come from. Right, the causality is reversed. So how this relates to the God question is, again, it makes more sense to define God as, in some sense, the idol we create upon having the transformative revelatory experience with the arena, right? And we only ever then have access to the idol of God. Now, we could go on and try and make metaphysical arguments about whether that thing, whatever that is, whatever we are relating to that is creating this extreme transformation and change, is literally there or not. But it's almost entirely secondary, because again, any attempt to sense make in that circumstance will force us into this idol making state, right? So it is, in a sense, it's almost like you're being asked to be purely dynamic, right? The moment you pause, this is the pillar of salt story, right? The moment you look back, you die, right? The moment you look away from God is the moment you have lost God entirely. If anything, it sounds like an extreme insightness. Man, my language freaking sucks right now. It seems like a call to a deeply mystic form of religion.
Right. So is that sort of the that usage of the pillar of salt? Is that sort of connecting to Nietzsche's kind of critique then, that the it being totalizing it, and actually no, I lost it. But okay, sorry. What Brett was saying earlier, though, that it was actually like sort of my sort of criticism of Vervaeke's, or at least what he said about how theism ultimately leads to nihilism, just automatically sort of rang as untrue, given how many examples I think we can kind of bring forth of people who were in a state of nihilism, and then theism was exactly the thing that brought them out of it.
But it was not theism.
It was
right. Theism was the secondary reaction right? It's the way to describe the transformation. But it wasn't theism in and of itself. It's not the set of propositions that did the transforming, right? It was something else, right?
Right. That's why I was saying it's a subtle,
Okay.
like, yeah.
Right.
No,
yeah. So that's a really
that's what I
interesting
mean.
distinction
No,
there.
No, but hold on. But that's what I mean. Having the proposition of God as the ground of being does not prohibit somebody having a transformational relationship with their conception of God, right? So,
Right.
so that's
But
why
it will break their idea of God in the process. I would almost say that's what those experiences are.
Wait a minute. Hold on. Are you saying that those experiences break their conception of God as the ground of all being?
It breaks whatever framing, whatever it is that the ground of all being was pointing to, it breaks that.
Right. So like if the ground of all being has some sort of inherent
it doesn't mean you
mystery
wouldn't
to
describe it the same way.
By having some sort of description that removes sort of the air of mystery within it. Is that kind of it?
Well, and to be clear to your point there, Brett, it doesn't mean that after the experience they have to describe it differently. It's that the referent, the thing that the words are pointing to, breaks. The structure that they thought they understood with those words no longer matches. Now, they might not have a better description than those words, but that novel contact with the thing is the thing doing the transforming. It's not the idea that God is the ground of all being, right? Even we could say you're stuck in a permanently revelatory state. You're constantly realizing what it means for God to be the ground of all being. Description is inadequate.
What he's saying right now, if you ever read like Eastern mysticism, someone will say these like super mystical statements that kind of point at what he's saying. He's spelling it out in detail, but they'll make a super mystical, like, once you see the secret, you can never know or become, you can never really truly know the secret. Once you have spoken the secret, it is no longer in you and a part of you, because you are no longer being transformed by the secret. And you're like, oh man, I get it now. And then you kind of, that's what he's talking. He's kind of spelling it out so that it makes sense to like a rational mind. But that's when you read these mystical books, they're always trying to be super mystical that way.
Right.
That's what they're getting at.
And Craig,
once you
I
understand,
agree with
you don't understand.
Yeah.
Once you understand it, Brett, you'll never understand. Once you understand that you can never understand, then you have the beginning of knowledge, Brett.
The beginning of wisdom, right? But and Craig, I had the same instinct that you had, that he seemed to be trying to disprove God through this. And
he disbelieves God, and here's the first time that it ever asserted itself into his project, because the only way that this statement makes any sense, that theism becomes nihilism, is if you actually don't think God exists. Then I'm just deluding myself in some sort of really super complicated way, instead of actually experiencing anything real about life itself.
I think I'll push back, because I do think that Vervaeke actually does make an argument against God's existence in like different conversations that he has. But I think this is more so an argument against the belief in God.
Yeah,
it's more an argument against the axial age grammar, which he thinks we generally find uninhabitable these days. It's no longer viable to us.
Right.
And all those statements are true. Everything that everybody said is true. They're all connected to the same thing. It's a kind of an argument against God. It's also an argument against theism, being a theist, thinking that way. And yeah, all of that makes sense.
Okay, I should say we've gone 50 minutes on this part. There's a lot of other stuff in this.
I want to get into the treatment of narrative, because my God, was that some of the worst lecturing I've heard from him.
All right. you want to kind of start in on
Take
that?
It away.
Nicholas?
Trash him do it.
So there was so many like individual bits that I can't remember right now, that just like.
Do you want me to give a little intro to it?
Yeah,
and then
please.
Sure. So, actually, I made a note about you in my. I said a note. Nick wanted Vervaeke's metaphysics. Here it is. So Vervaeke says that Heidegger's proposing a non-teleological way of being. that there's no narrative to the rose. It's above and beyond narrative. And Vervaeke says, this is, perhaps we can't get back to a narrative in the sense of a teleological aspect. Perhaps the universe is like the rose. Maybe it's blooming from itself, grounded in itself, shining from itself, while always withdrawing. Now I don't have that much of a problem with that statement, but I imagine the theists in this call probably do have have quite a problem with that statement. But we've also talked about teleology and before too, and so proposing teleology out. But let me ask you: I haven't quite understood teleology. Like, is teleology does it only come from God, or do we have?
It's literally any goal or end. Right. The teleology of me going to work is to get money.
Okay. All right.
But
so I
couldn't you say also
I want to
like
qualify that slightly.
The teleology of the needle and the compass is towards north. Like, that's another usage of teleology that doesn't have any sort of like natural intention behind it.
Well, this is the thing. Like, teleology, strictly speaking, is an Aristotelian idea. So, and Aristotle had very clear regarding intention. He had very clear intentions and ideas with. He thought everything was acting on purpose. Like, everything had a definite end to come to, like a complete and a finished and a final and an absolute way that was immutable. And so, like, if you've got a hammer, the purpose of the hammer is to hit nails into the ground, like that's what makes it a good hammer. It's
or if you have an ear, then the purpose of the ear is to be able to hear.
Right. And if it's a good ear, then it hears well. If it's a bad ear, then it doesn't hear well. And then the teleology is basically what allows you to make sense of, well, is it good, is it bad, what purpose is it serving, why is it here?
And I take issue with teleology if it's assigned by the universe. I don't take issue with it as sort of a metaphorical, way of talking about it. I think it's useful there. But here, let me just finish the summary.
Are ears not assigned by the universe to hear?
No, well, I would say the ears evolved to hear, but not in a purposeful sense of the universe specifically designed it with that intent in mind. So to speak.
I just have one question to ask very quickly, and that is, if the universe doesn't actually have an inherent purpose, why are we trying to conform ourselves to the universe? Like, how does that work?
Well, that's interesting
realism?
Because I've wondered about that too through this. Like, why do we just assume meaning is about getting in tune with reality? And like, why should that necessarily follow? Why can't people have plenty of meaning by being completely wrong, and but it just makes their lives really good, and not necessarily connected to reality?
Because you'd have to check if it would make their lives really good. The corresponding your belief system to reality is a way of defending yourself from if your beliefs don't correspond to reality. Yeah, it could be really good and entertaining, but there's going to be some sort of reckoning down the line.
It could
because
be, right.
But the very idea that your belief should correspond to reality undermines the idea that you can act on, that there's any meaning to purposeful action in the first place, because you are constructing something that does not correspond to reality. It's an ideal thing it's solipsistic ultimately. That's what I feel is the crux.
Well, except that, like, what I've said is meaning. Like, meaning is a sense that we have, right? It's the feeling that we have that gives us a lot of meaning, so to speak. It gives us a lot of well-being, right? So meaning in itself can't be illusionary. Like, we can be wrong, we can have a wrong interpretation, but if something gives us meaning, we have that deep sense of well-being that I don't know how to describe. We have that deep sense of meaning, so that exists no matter what. That can't be illusion.
The question is, why should we assume that sense or whatever it is in some sense trying to get at reality? Why is it not something?
Well, that's what I was asking. Yeah, why should we assume that? I agree with that. Like, I don't know that we should just. Now, I think.
I'm highly critical of that myself.
When it's not always trying to get at reality. A lot of times that meaning, all that meaning means is that it resonates deeply with you for sometimes knowable reasons, sometimes mysterious reasons. But sometimes those meaning-making things Like, for example, when I was young, I just wanted to hook up with girls. That meaning making, that was everything. And that a huge chunk of everything I did was that end in mind. Now that's because your body is kind of pushing you to do that. But, you know, that's a meaning making device that ultimately, there's a whole, never mind. There's thousands of different things. Wait, never mind.
Yeah, there are certain like teleological ends that we can accept and work towards that end up ultimately self-destructive.
Right.
Well,
now,
just on the teleology. So here's what Vervaeke says. Now, I think, to be fair to him, I think he's talking about a universal teleology rather than the teleology that of us going to work, for example. So he says, an ever-expanding universe coming out of the Big Bang, but grounded in the quantum. We get better at being connected to its physis. I can go back. Physis is blossoming forth from itself. The Greek core of the word physics, trying to get back to a re-experience of the physical is an important way of remembering the being mode. Anyway, we can talk about that. But we get better at being connected to its physis if we drop the axial age requirement that there is a teleological narrative to it all. Narrative gives us important practice in something. It gives us cognitive existential practice in non-logical identity. So he's saying
there was so much in that too, that and then he used the example of him as a child compared to him now, and how, again, it just seems so weird to say that that's non-logical, because to my mind that's the stuff from which logic is born.
But this goes back to the whole Parmenides issue, because there's change involved. If there's change, then it can't be sameness, and it's the development over time which is it's refuting the logical identity. It's not necessarily it's logical identity as it is traditionally conceptualized, which is the propositional. It's the absolutizing propositional system, which Vervaeke is trying to criticize.
The A of us, so the A of us at 5 is different than the A of us at 35. They're not. So A doesn't quite equal A. That's what he means by non-logical there.
Sure. Yeah. Again, that seems like,
but there is still some sort of identity shared, which is what's
to some fundamental error to begin with, and then responding to that as if it is a metaphysical reality seems, and
it may also just show a weakness of logic, that logic isn't really meant to talk about A in this sense of us as a developing person. Like,
so okay, I want to play around with the teleological bit here, because there's an aspect with which I agree with Vervaeke, and then there's again the aspect where I heavily disagree. So I don't think we can actually escape a telos, and I don't think Vervaeke does either. I think what he does is he replaces a static telos with a dynamic telos. So that's to say, what he's pointing to, or even with the description of the flower, is that there's some optimal state by which this dynamic unfolding can reach its maximum potential, right? That's his orienting mechanism. Otherwise, there's no reason to meditate. There's no reason to do any of this, right? It's that he fundamentally believes that there is some optimal state with which to go through life. Now, that is a telos. Your goal is reaching the state where the dynamics of life are reaching their fullest potential. But it's not static in the sense that it's not like the crystallized vision of heaven that is permanently static and stuck forevermore.
Well, see, this is why I said the requirement that there be a teleological narrative to it all. I think by to it all, we have to read that in as some overarching narrative of the universe.
Right, but wait, slow down, because if you listen to what he just said, he just gave one. He just pointed out
he gave a teleology to ourselves, but that's not that's different from the teleology of the universe.
But he gave an overarching teleological project to that fits perfectly with John Vervaeke's worldview to a life, and it works.
But I don't think Vervaeke's talking about a teleology to a life. He's talking about a teleology to the universe as a whole, I think.
Maybe.
I think his statement is only meant to refer to.
Then why bring up the flower?
Yeah. I think Brett. I think he's right. I think he's pointing out the logical contradiction that's right in that little area of his thought process, because he is providing an overarching teleology to it all.
There are too many hard words to pronounce in these lectures, aren't there?
But just how he said it, that was almost perfectly encapsulated what John Vervaeke's mission is. That John Vervaeke would hear that and go, yeah, that's probably almost exactly what I'm doing. Well, that's a theology. It's a dynamic theology to it all. It's a perfectly just. It's a really usable, good one that works. It's just dynamic. It's not, you're going to be a rocket ship builder.
Yeah.
You're going to be a maximized potential being. It's a little bit airy fairy, but it totally works. It's like,
likewise, I would say, at least with Christianity, the telos that it gives is not the static one that we normally associate with it. I think when you look at Revelations, which is where it gets most of its teleology from, it is giving you a vision of a dynamic telos.
I would have to disagree there.
If you can figure out a way to before you disagree, I would love to hear you spell that out. Not necessarily right now, but
very briefly. In Revelation, like it speaks about the New Jerusalem as a place without water, and that's symbolic for chaos. Water is always symbolic for chaos in the Bible, so it's a place without chaos. So there's the eternal order is very much implicit in that narrative. If you're going to invoke Revelation, that's just a losing argument.
See, I don't think that's correct.
Like the waters are at bay in the New Jerusalem in Revelation.
Waters are like crystal.
There are no waters anymore.
And it within symbolism, water represents some sort of change that occurs. Then
it's fundamentally chaos. It's the unformed chaos. And so, like you have the whole idea of the separation of waters and so on and so forth, and that's the movements and the dynamic aspects of creation.
Well, and the counter would be, why merge heaven and earth if there is no dynamic play? Why not just end earth and have heaven?
Well, yeah, that the new earth is.
Why
heaven.
have self-consciousness to begin with? Why go through the movement of allowing free will to have it rejoined? Right? To me, these are hinting towards a dynamic vision of what this state is. Otherwise, we would end up with a God that stayed permanently uncreated.
Well, I mean, I kind of agree with you, but that's also why I find Christianity hard to believe. So
it's such a cool idea, though. I would love to hear you, not now, but think that through and spell it out the way you do with Vervaeke, a dynamic theology of Christianity. And I'll shop that around. I'll like go debate people on that, because that's a cool idea. Most people think of Christianity the way he's talking about it, like it's an end product, he's talking about a dynamic growth theology, like a constantly evolving meaning in the concept of Christianity. It's a cool idea.
Yeah,
I just would love to
I view that as being in
much.
direct relationship to the creator. That does not give us a vision of something that stops creating. It means creation potential is reaching its maximal in each moment. Now, you could describe that as an extreme abundance of order, or you can view it as that exact line where order and chaos, right? The ordering principle is dominant because it is constantly creating through the potential.
Right. Constant creativity and a fountain, I totally understand what you're saying. I think it's cool.
Yeah, but I think talking about the boundary of order and chaos, I mean, that Peterson also does that a lot. Jordan Peterson, I mean, that's correct. But I do think that there was a tendency, particularly within the ancient Greeks, they prioritized order over chaos. And I think that like the meaning crisis and the nihilism and everything that the people talk about, it's precisely like when you try and have the order without the chaos, you try and get rid of the chaos completely, then the order itself becomes meaningless because you lose the contrast, so you can't make sense of it anymore. So you have to have both, and it's wrong to try and
the chaos would be related to the withdrawing, right? Too, I think.
Well, I think like the inexhaustible moreness, that dynamic. I mean, that speaks very strongly to me of chaos, and I tend to like I like that actually. I think yes, that's where I would criticize Vervaeke is that like I think his distinction between the sacred and sacredness, that's beautiful. The thing is that he goes too far with the sacredness and he tries to like obscure the sacred. And it's like, no, we need both together. Like when they're playing off against each other, that's when you're in the zone of proximal development, let's say. That's like when you're in the zone.
That's interesting.
Yeah. Well, and yes, that is what I get as the vision of what Christianity is aiming for. I think
that's what it should be. If it, insofar as it's aiming at that, yeah, I like that Christianity very much.
Yes. And again, I'm also working backwards here, right? It's through having religious experience that I go about framing my understanding of the religion. Mm-hmm. And through the religious experience, that's what was being experienced, not some type of static perfection or, anything like that. So I could very well be blamed of shoehorning
ad hoc reasoning.
Yeah. Yes.
No, well, the issue is, you see, particularly with Christianity, as I said in the book of John, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. It's like the verbal elements of it feature so heavily. And so you see people, like the idea, we're fundamentally grappling with the idea that our words can contact reality, that they in some sense we can speak of the world. Like there's the idea behind that is that in some sense there's some reality behind our words. And so like we have no choice but to construct
our words do have an effect on how we perceive the world.
Yeah, and we have no choice but to construct an idol. But you see, so like the problem is, do you mistake the idol for the thing that it's representing, or can you move beyond it? And there's like but you can't speak without creating the idol.
Yeah,
like Nietzsche was very strong on this point as well. And Vervaeke actually brought that up in another episode where he made reference to Nietzsche saying, "I fear we shall never be rid of God while we still believe in grammar."
Right. So okay, going back to the disagreement that was sort of being had between Brett and Nick, I think Brett is pointing out that while Vervaeke talks about sort of the neo-teleological aspect to the universe blooming forth or the flower blooming forth, he's not saying that those are the same or within the same totalizing scope as what is meant by the blooming forth of, say, a person and sort of that transformation of them into their more.
I mean, he also even directly compares it to the universe, right? He even uses the example of.
But I think like his like source of transformation is ultimately Darwinistic. That they're like, because of the nature or the functioning aspects of the dynamic telos of natural selection, that is what brings us this sort of transformative aspect of telos or change that occurs. But that's not at all the same sort of process that changes the universe into sort of this more expansive self. And so it seems like I don't know, there's multiple different sorts of blooming forths that are taking place that aren't necessarily overlapping with each other.
Yeah, so just to clarify, are you implying that perhaps, okay, let's say hypothetically Darwinian evolution, that doesn't have like a purpose, it's not well ordered,
right?
It's chaotic, but the universe as a whole, that evolution is actually well ordered and is following, it's not necessarily a classical theistic plan, but it's some kind of plan that isn't just chaotic and unplanned like Darwinian evolution.
Well,
it's different species.
Its mode, I guess, of transformation is different from the way that species or that species.
Yeah, so we have to have a different we have to have a different account for all of the different kinds of environments we're talking about. We can't just have one for everything, like Darwin and the universe and society.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. I gotta go.
But that's the same of literally any teleology.
Thanks, Craig.
Okay. Thanks, Craig.
Yeah, this was cool.
Great.
Cheers.
Yes, really good. Yeah, nice meeting you. Bye, guys.
Bye, Craig.
Craig.
Hold on. There was a quote we talked about right before the stream, where he talks about horizontal versus vertical narrative. And we were trying to sort of parse out what he meant by this. He says, instead of a horizontal narrative, we can do the vertical ontology, in which connecting the depths of ourselves to the depths of being in a non-teleology being mode.
Yeah, to
Like
me, that's an abject misunderstanding of what narrative is at all. Like, I don't even know what he is referencing. It's frustrating.
Like, what's a non-teleological narrative? Is it just sort of mindfulness being a narrative that's sort of just describing things as they are and not with any kind of purpose? I mean,
I suppose, but
if a teleological narrative is something moving towards something else, then a non-teleological narrative would be something like, I guess, moving not towards something else, but like, I guess, away from itself, maybe.
But he's talking about the vertical, the up and down, and I'm still not quite sure what it.
See, this is a limit of narrative, right? In some sense, we are stuck communicating the horizontal axis of narrative
across
but
time.
The purpose of doing that is to communicate that vertical axis that he's talking about. We don't form narratives to just recount a meaningless list of events. They're always pointing towards an ontological reality that you can't actually get your hands on, right? It's like you have the tower of the ontology, and when it's hit by the light, right, it forms the shadow that is a narrative, right? The story, the form.
So is it kind of like, okay, when we say something like like I'm doing better at my job or I'm doing worse at my job, this is I guess an evaluative difference between what I'm like now and what I was previously. And that's sort of, but we're really trying to get at the I guess, ontology difference between those.
It's insight and self-reflection is insight, really, right?
But like, and it actually, to be able to even communicate some sort of like ontological difference between self A and self B, you have to use time, maybe through a sort of a narrative.
There's no other way to hint at it. Now, I would agree that we cannot capture that ontological movement, that vertical movement in the horizontal, but we have no better tool to show what is happening in that vertical axis than through horizontal narrative. But again, the purpose of narrative, the thing we are calling narrative, is it's rooted in communicating that vertical axis.
So what do you mean that we can't communicate it on the horizontal? Like, is that something like you can't just say that things automatically get better over time?
What I think Vervaeke is trying to say is that you shouldn't try and live your life like the day that you die is the day that everything's finally settled and like, you're finished and you've accomplished everything. Like the way
that would be a teleological sort of Aristotelian.
That's like
notion.
The horizontal way. The vertical way would be you are living every single day, but on the day you are trying to maximize your own development and your own growth, and there's no end product to it because you don't stop growing. It's just moreness, like, and it's better and more and more and more, and it's an ongoing thing.
But when you say maximize my own growth, you're bringing in the teleology.
That's the point I was
right. But it's vertical. It's not horizontal. I think
he said non-teleologically vertical. Non-teleological. He says a non-teleological being mode.
The thing, as I was saying, that makes no sense to me. Like, you have to have a purpose. If you don't, you cannot make sense of it without using purpose as your.
Except in a mindfulness way. Except in a mindfulness way, where mindfulness shouldn't be teleological. It should just be awareness and introspection, and just saying what is my being now. Not what will it be or what was it? What is it now? That may be what he's getting at, but I don't understand how that's narrative. Because he said instead of a horizontal narrative, we can do a vertical, like maybe in addition to. I don't know why. Like a lot of these languages, you shouldn't do this instead of you should do this in addition to. Like horizontal narrative is pretty darn useful. I don't know why we'd want to get rid of it.
Yeah. And I think we've brought this up before, like Nick, especially that like Vervaeke is presenting a narrative through this whole awakening from the meaning crisis.
He's using narrative to tell you why you shouldn't use narrative. I mean, like
Except
in the sentence,
he still likes narrative, but maybe he hasn't. Like, he still brings up narrative all the way through and recognizes the usefulness of it. I think he's trying to figure out a new type of narrative, but he hasn't given an example of it. He's gotten away from, he used to give a lot more examples. And I think he wants to do so much now, and fit him into an hour, that he's taking out some of the examples that would be really useful here.
I think
I get
you
the
kind of touched on
sensation
it.
that he's just confused. He doesn't know what he's talking about.
Well, I think you sort of laid it out pretty well in one of our chat logs, Nick, that like Vervaeke's metaphysics is purely for pragmatic purposes rather than for like on holding some sort of ontology. And so similar to that, like any sort of narrative we might have would have
it's
like
in service to communicating the ontological vertical axis.
Right.
So, and in that regard, I agree with him. That's the point of narrative. My issue is that he doesn't say this is what narrative is, why it exists at all. He says, get rid of narrative. This other thing is better.
No, he does. Well, here's what he says. He says narrative is a way of representing through time, symbolically. It represents how we have a non-logical identity to yourself. So, like he does seem to still like narrative. Narrative gives us important practice in something. So he relates it to that play, that serious play. Yeah. So he's not totally against narrative. He's just against literal fundamentalist narrative.
Sure. And I agree with that. Why I said it seems confused is because he's not making those lines. Yeah. He's using large words with lots of meanings, not separating them out, and then conflicting himself in the next sentence. Right. So we can even move on from this because he leads from this section right into the bit about symbols and symbolism.
Well, wait, hold on. Just before we get there, can we just look at he brings back in relevance realization, where he says, so he talked about this pure shining, so the blooming forth. He goes, shining leads down to phenomenon, to experience, to relevance realization. And he says, relevance realization equals shining, the salient landscaping into intelligibility. Now, this confused me because before he equated relevance realization with intelligence. So how could it also equal the shining, unless we're going to say the shining forth is intelligence, but in terms of the blooming flower, that doesn't really make sense. So I'm not.
Well, remember, he wasn't only doing intelligence, but like shining in to do with wisdom and the ability to overcome self-deception. And so I guess if the shining is of breaking through your self-deceptions, then maybe that's the connection there.
Well, the shining of a flower, it's not merely the flower on its own, it's you perceiving the flower. So the shining of the flower is you being aware of the flower, which means there is an intelligence there because
well hold on, hold on. Does there have to be intelligence?
Well, yes, because otherwise how are you aware of the flower? That's you see, if you're not aware of the flower but aware of something else that's not the flower, then that's not intelligent. That's dumb.
Are you meaning like informational content within the flower that our mind is able to sort of grasp onto?
Well, yeah, that's fundamentally the implicit idea at the bottom.
Okay, but not so, not that the flower itself has to have some sort of mental activity to it, but just that the flower has to have something that we can grasp with.
But intelligence can't just be mental activity, right? Then we'd be talking about cognition, not intelligence, right?
Sure. I would say intelligence would have to come out of some sort of mental activity.
Right. No, intelligence is a type of mental activity, but it's not.
Right.
I would say perceiving the flower, I wouldn't call intelligence. You know, what you do with the flower, figuring out what to do with the flower is intelligence.
Yeah, well,
or recognizing its blooming, endless blooming from inside of itself.
I would argue that intelligence is a quality of cognition. It's it's the quality of the cognition itself that determines whether it's intelligent or not. So there's it's the normative. It would be the normative pivot of cognition if you are working from the paradigm that cognition is fundamentally geared towards ascertaining the truth.
Right. Okay. So it seems like we're all sort of like in disagreement with Vervaeke here, in that that narratives still serve a fundamental usage for people, and being able to like communicate ideas through symbolism and things like that. Is that really like why is it that he's arguing, making this case against narrative? Is he just making the case against like dogmatic narratives that we hold to as if they hold propositional content to them that are statically always true?
And I would agree if he made that case, but he didn't make the case that way.
Right.
Well, see, I agree. I think that's his purpose. That's his intent. But I think sometimes his words get away from him.
He goes too far.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah. Like I think that's his goal, is to say, I'm not against narrative. I'm just against a certain type of narrative. And in describing what he doesn't like about the fundamentalist narrative, he goes too far in his wording that makes it seem like he's against all narrative. But we have to read it with his other stuff.
I think it's quite the thing that stands out for me is when he talks about like the time in his life when he realized that there could never be a science of relevance, and that was before he came up with relevance realization. And that whole thing shaded his perception of what is possible in terms of things like science. And so he's eschewing what has gone before, and he's like, okay, well, that's impossible, so what's the alternative? Okay, I've got to construct the alternative. This is what the alternative looks like. And he's building a step-by-step process and say, well, it's not, what's not this, what's not this, what's not this. But in the process, I think he's going too far.
And then he talks about realness as the creative tension between confirmation, coherence, and moreness. And
that sounds kind of like woo. I don't know. I don't know if I can understand what he's meaning by that.
Like he says, if the virtual reality, which by that I guess I get is
like phenomenal experience.
Yeah. Just has the confirmation and coherence, it falls flat. If it can't provoke a sense of open wonder, if there's no element of surprise, if it's all a simulation, John, and no accommodation, the experience of awe and wonder, if it's just foreclosure and never just the opening, if it's just the homing and never the numinous, then it's not real. It's not experienced as real. Now, what that last little bit is, I think he keeps on going back and forth between it's not real and it's not experienced as real. These are two very different things. I can experience something as real and it's not real, or I could not experience something as real that is real. Like he seems to be, realness can't be just based on our experience, though we could use our experience to help determine what's real. And when he talks about the experience of wonder, I mean, that's great. And I like it when he talked about the sacred, but just because, it can't be if we don't have an experience of wonder. If I don't have an experience of wonder looking at my laptop right now, that doesn't mean my laptop's not real, or my experience of my laptop's not real. So
this definition almost reminds me of like his lecture on Descartes, that like Descartes kind of split things up between the subjective and the objective, where whatever objects to the subjective, like whatever like causes us, whatever goes against our assumptions, this is what's real. Like this is what like matter is in that sense. And if like he's, I guess in that sense, sort of connecting the transformative quality or the transformative aspect to whatever, or he's saying whatever is capable of doing that transformative aspect is what's real, similar to like I guess Descartes. But
it just seems like an unnecessary redefinition of real that's just going to cause confusion. Leaving it to the sacred.
I think he's trying to bring back in like meaning, because like within Descartes' conception of like what's real as only being matter that objects to you, or matter that transforms you, that automatically leaves off all meaning as being delusional, or meaning as being irrelevant, or I don't know, in a sense that it's not meaningful, I guess. And so he's like wanting to bring in the transformative qualities to meaning making into
sure, but that's useful. But he said if you don't have that, it's not real, which seems wrong.
That reminds me again of the idol conversation from earlier, which is to say we start again, confusing our idols of reality for reality.
Mm-hmm.
And in that sense, we aren't interacting with what is real, right? And that we have certain qualia that tell us when we are encountering reality. And that he's trying to highlight what these qualia are that give us the sense of realness, right? So that we can tell from when we are living inside of our kind of delusional city architecture from when we are encountering
okay,
reality.
so that's his, like, if you're not undergoing some sort of change or transformation or progression, then you're in some sort of like delusionary state, I guess. I don't know, that almost
That doesn't seem
like
right,
too
does it?
far.
Yeah.
but
Sorry. Well, I was just quickly, I was going to say, like, to have this extra sense of meaning and on wonder is great, but why does that mean everything else sucks? You know, not everything has to be this sense of transformation. You know, we're not always trying to transform ourselves. You know, but when I'm eating my breakfast, it's not transformative.
It is though. Like, the reality of it is that your body is literally transforming.
Yeah, but
like,
cereal
sense of wonder,
experienced in a mundane way, I think that's what Brett's getting at.
Yeah. So I guess part of that is right. One might see how not being aware of the transformation taking place could lead one towards right I'll just use the Christian word, towards sin, towards missing the mark, right? If you're unaware of the transformation that is the reality of you consuming whatever it is you're consuming, then you start consuming things that are not in service to the transformation.
Right. Okay. So that makes a lot of sense in connection to his like wisdom as that which helps us overcome self-deception. That if we're not overcoming self-deception, if we're not like transforming our models of reality, then we're in some sort of state of or lack of wisdom, I guess.
Well, and again, it's like a really complicated way of bringing back up Peterson's zone of optimal. Well, that's Piaget, but
yeah,
on the boundary of order and chaos. If you have too much chaos, the transformation overwhelms you. If you have too much order, you're living in a delusional simulation of reality, right? So it's like, how do you find that?
That's right up your alley, isn't it, Struan?
Yeah, I really wanted to go here as well because I'm actually, I don't know why, because there was that whole conversation between Ian McGilchrist and Vervaeke on Rebel Wisdom, which just does not seen the light of day, and I'm quite upset about that. But be that as it may, I'm very much struck by Vervaeke's language and the way that he speaks. I think that what he's speaking about is like the left hemisphere has a bias towards closed information, and the right hemisphere has a bias towards open information. And if the right hemisphere isn't engaged in what you're doing, then it's going to feel superficial, and therefore it's not going to feel real. It's going to feel like it's not satisfying. And what he's saying is, for meaning and for meaningful behavior, you've got to have that right hemisphere aspect engaging and being immersed in the content. Otherwise, it's just going to feel hollow and meaningless.
Do you think there's a real difference? Like, do you think there's a difference? Do you think he thinks there's a difference between what is real and what is experienced as real? Are those two different things? To me, they are.
I'm sure he does.
But he's using them interchangeably. He's using them interchangeably.
Yeah.
So
I very much agree with you that he's shifting the definition of real, and I don't like that very much. It's another question as to exactly how he's defining it. Yeah, it's a big black box to me, honestly. Like relevance realization, when you collapse the subjective and the objective together like that, I no longer am able to make sense of what you mean by real, because to me, real always means, or it always has the implication of some kind of mind-independent existence.
Right.
Like,
yes. Like
the mind, and the thing is,
whether or
like,
not somebody sees it. Yeah.
Yeah, and even going back to the ancient Greeks, they made the distinction between reality and appearance. And like, if you're not, you can define reality, and then you could define on its own terms, and then you can define it not in its own terms. And what Vervaeke does is he says, I mean reality as opposed to illusion. But then the question is, how do you define illusion? Because you can't say, well, illusion is what is not real, because that's circular. Then you haven't defined reality. And the only definition that I know of for illusion that isn't not real is something that's only in the mind. And so, like when he makes a relevance realization, he collapses the subjective and the objective. It's like, well, what does real mean? There's no, it's become amorphous, like being, like with, that's exactly the problem that Heidegger had, as far as I'm concerned.
Well, if that's kind of the thing, if he's grounding it within some sort of phenomenal experience of transformation, then that's at least some sort of notion of like, okay, when I'm undergoing this feeling of
I'm
awe,
fine with that, but don't
I'm in touch with the real. When I'm not doing that, it's when I'm in some sort of delusionary state.
Well, I would have no problem. It's like, well, if he said this transformation is important and you should make it the epitome of your life, and it's like where all of the meaning is found, and it's absolute, and like I'd have no problem with that. It's the fact that he says, well, this is real. Like,
that's my problem too.
Like if he could divorce those two, if he could present his project not in terms of realism, I would be so much more happier with it.
Well, he seems to be talking more about sacredness than realness here.
Exactly, and that's useful. I sincerely believe that, that in the distinction between sacredness and the sacred is like the sacred is literally the left hemisphere's idea of the divine, and sacredness is like the right hemisphere's idea of the divine, and you need them both because, like Peterson says, the zone of proximal development is on the boundary of order and chaos, but then you can use that as a metaphor for regarding or a symbol, let's say, for the left hemisphere being the symbol of being order and the right hemisphere being chaos. And so they work together like that. And so you are trying to get the best of both worlds by getting them into harmony with each other, accepting the fact that they are contrapletes. They complete each other through their contrast, through their opposition.
What was the context of like what he was saying that this was real? Because if like all he's meaning by like, if you're undergoing transformation, this means that it's real. If what he's referring to is just our like phenomenal experiences or like relevancy realization, that like you're really recognizing relevancy if you're undergoing some sort of transformation. That way it wouldn't be like sort of making this sort of weird, I guess
like if he said more, even if you use, I don't like it, but even if you use the wishy-washy more real, like I don't really like more real, but even that I would make more sense.
Yeah.
To not say it's more real when you're in touch in that way.
The virtual reality words that he uses, it reminds me of the example that he brings up is virtual reality is like MMORPGs. People play that, but it exhausts itself. Like it doesn't seem real. It's not.
Yeah.
It's a facade. It's not satisfying. There's like it's missing some kind of substance. And he's asserting that the moreness is that substance. If it has the moreness, then it would be satisfying, and you would say, oh well, that's real. It's the lack of that substance which makes you go, oh well, that's just virtual. It's not meaningful. It's just a triviality.
Oh yeah, I can think that substance is undergoing some sort of transformation from that, I guess.
Like I can think of times playing an adventure game and where I'm completely immersed in it, and then suddenly a character acts in a very odd way or repeats a line of dialogue that breaks the immersion, and you really get hit with the sense of, oh, it's not real. Although for a while you do have almost that feeling it's real, but then you hit the limit of it.
Right.
That's when that sense of realness goes away.
Yeah, so and Vervaeke's point is that the world never does that.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense then. Like if we could connect that to his like the world is combinatorially explosive,
exactly.
And there is no sort of limit to realness that we can have from it.
It's ultimately indefinite.
Yeah. That's the thing that sometimes I get confused by him in whether I should interpret him as a modernist or as a postmodernist, because some of the things he says is like completely postmodernist, and that like there is no actual essence to a thing. Everything is combinatorially explosive. There's no telos to things, but yet he's still very much like within the framework of modern science, which is, while it's not exclusive to postmodernism, it is certainly irregular to see matched up so perfectly with it. And that's the thing. I don't know if he does have a perfect match between his scientific thinking and his postmodernist thinking.
Well, no, he would say you could probably continue to scientifically study things in an inexhaustible way. So I think it lines up in the same inexhaustible.
Well, the question is, what do you mean by science? Because I mean, there's science like, well, I go and put on my cloak every morning. Sorry, my coat, and you know.
Are you a wizard?
Yeah, but you know, and you do a job, and then there's the other one, like a scientist. You know, who properly believes in universalism, but the thing is, like, Vervaeke explicitly talks about universalism, and he lionizes it. So you know that this won't.
What do
get
you
him
mean by
out,
universalism there? Because that has
well,
multiple meanings.
Science looks for general things that have universal application.
Gotcha.
Like
Okay,
applies to everybody generally, but it's always, you know, ultimately the idea is, well, there is one narrative, there's a grand narrative, there's one story. That's what's in conflict with postmodernism. Like postmodernism and science, just on that level, there's zero agreement whatsoever.
Except in science, the story is always changing. So
yes, but the idea is always that ultimately there's one story, and we are discovering that story, and the reason it's changing is because we're getting better at describing that story, and that's the progress.
Right. Yeah, it still holds that the story that science tells is true. Like, this is, like, even if it might be that our
that's the
version of the
arc.
story isn't quite right yet, there is a story.
Yeah, and so science has this implicit normative telos built within it that postmodernism simply just like destroys totally.
Right. Yeah. Within postmodernism, truth isn't inherently valuable. Whereas within science,
well, but I think it's also in postmodernism, from what I get, I still have to read more into it, but I got the sense that you never have access to the absolute right story. That we're continuously revising our stories, and there's an inexhaustible number of stories.
Yeah, everything's provisional.
Yeah, and that's science too. Everything in science is provisional as well. So I don't think
but the difference is, like, the postmodernism is defined as a skepticism towards grand narratives, and the idea of a grand narrative is that you can precisely tell everything in one story. You see, so everybody operates according to the same story. Therefore, you can have empirical testing and peer-reviewed results.
But are they? But I got the sense, and again, I haven't looked into this enough, and I've listened to some people, but I haven't read any of it. But I got the sense that they object to the grand narrative because you can never know if you've gotten it right. Not that it doesn't potentially exist in some unachievable way.
It's much more fundamental than that.
Even saying that you get it right is a modernist way of thinking, I think. Whereas within postmodernism, getting it right, that's not, there's nothing there exactly.
Yeah, I've got to look more into postmodernism. Like I've heard like reasonable descriptions of it and then silly descriptions of it, and the reasonable ones make a lot of sense to me. You know, in that, like Vervaeke talks about, and even Jordan Peterson has acknowledged he's a postmodernist to this extent, where he agrees that you could, like he talked about it with the Bible, that you could read the Bible in an infinite number of ways.
Is that there's no coherent, coordinated postmodernist movement. There are a couple of thinkers who are generally regarded as postmodernist, and it's their collection of ideas is basically mixed and matched by people in society today, and that gets identified as postmodernism. So it is, you won't find a finished definition to postmodernism, but there was something I wanted to say about the whole grand narrative and the differences thing, but it escapes me now. So I'll try and think about that. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah, that's fine.
So Nick, you wanted to move on to the imaginal and the symbolic?
Yeah, it was more of it was writing off the tail of his criticism of narrative, and then he launches right into the importance of symbols and symbolism, and I found it really bizarre. And likewise, I got, again, that really heavy feeling of Platonic thought, because coming straight out of a criticism of narrative, it gives the feeling that he considers these symbols as archetypal, pure representations of something, that they can, in some sense, exist not within a narrative, in and of themselves.
I think he thinks they can communicate something more to you than a mere proposition.
But
they can. Sorry. Yeah.
Well, no. Okay. Well, I've got one question for you here. Is there a distinction between propositions and narrative? Is it, or are they one and the same thing to you?
No, I think they probably are different. Like he almost said, narrative is a symbol. I think.
Yeah. Well, that's exactly what like the narrative aspect. Like a symbol without a narrative almost doesn't make sense to me. Yeah. Like if the really great stories are the ones that actually, when you look at the whole story from beginning to end, actually constructs a symbol.
Mm. Yeah, he's not against symbol and narrative. He's just against a particular point of view on it. Like and I don't think he's quite figured out, and I don't think any of us have, of how you do this open-ended narrative, how you do these open-ended symbols, that won't fall into fundamentalism and literalism.
Well, they always will. That's the downside of encoding at all.
I think, yeah, but you see, this is the thing, is like you shouldn't totalize fundamentalism, but you shouldn't get rid of it. It has its place, but the thing is to put it in its proper place.
Yes.
Like there is a space for the propositional, and we need to be able to articulate the fundamentals of our beliefs, given that our fundamental beliefs actually are what construct our civilizational institutions.
But I think it's it's that, are we open to changing those fundamental beliefs if we find out that they're wrong or need to be changed? And that's the problem with, so it's not about not codifying, it's that being open to codify in a dynamic manner.
Yeah, but the solution to that is to actually build our narrative in such a way that it is open to self-correction. Like,
right.
Yeah.
Do you guys like this concept of the imaginal versus imagination?
I thought it was useful for being able to re-enter, like kind of reclaim what has in many ways been dragged through the mud, both by people fighting against the imaginary and also the people taking it up and taking it too far.
Yeah, so I found it interesting how he connected, like, where there was this sort of split within dualism, of especially Cartesian dualism, between the objective and the subjective. He was sort of making the case that the reason for that was he got rid of the imaginal, which is sort of that bridge between the two. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say that there's a very strong idea that the imaginal is creative, and like, the idea of creativity is actually a very strong theme within the pre-axial religions. Like all of the stories that they would tell were stories of creation. But it's not that they were trying to tell a story of creation. It's that they were trying to tell a story of getting creation right. So like, because everybody was participating in creation. Like you create children, you recreate life. And so they were trying to actually dominate or master that narrative so that they could flourish.
So let me just present for people watching what he describes at the imaginal, then we can get more into it. So he says imagination, imaginary is what we typically mean, is the subjective experience of generating inner mental imagery, which we know is not real. That's completely in our control, and we play with it as we wish. And that's not what, he says Corbyn, this is in the section on Corbyn, that's not what Corbyn's talking about. I think it's Henry Corbyn. There are two ways we represent and come into contact with reality. Abstract representations, the intelligible world, we grasp reality through mathematical formula, through the intellect, that type of thing, and concrete, the sensible world. So touching things, seeing things, hearing things. And so the imaginal, he says, mediates between the abstract and the concrete, bridging between them, and allows them to come together in a meaningfully structured experience. So in my phenomenological experience, there is intelligible order that I can extract intellectually, but also come into sensual contact concretely with things. I'm not quite sure what this means. Is it like I can pick up an apple and understand as I'm picking it up that it's nourishment, and then bring it to my mouth and taste it while I'm understanding I'm giving myself food? Is that he's talking about here?
Well, it's like kind of like I would use the example of Einstein. He created a completely new way of looking at the world through his imagination. He literally created a new world in that sense. The imaginal is that landscape where we do that kind of thing.
But he says it bridges between the abstract and the concrete, so it can't just be in your head, or it's not transjective.
No, but you have the idea of general relativity. Then you go out in the world and you build your GPS satellites, and so then you navigate and you go everywhere you want to go. That's both, because it is creative, because it ties them together, because you're actually able to use the theory to act in the world.
Wait, hold on. Is the imaginal something we're always doing, or just doing sometimes? Like, are we only doing it when we say, okay, I take my theory of something and then I apply it to the concrete? Is that the only? Is that?
I think the imaginal is more like the. It's like in contrast, let's say, to the emotional. You know, it's not that you sometimes you are feeling emotions, but it's not only when you're feeling the emotion that you are emotional. The emotional is not only when you are emotional. So the imaginal is it's not just when you are doing
a realm,
imagination.
Yeah. It's not even like an area of subjective experience necessarily, because it falls back on its transjective framing.
But what would be a mundane, what would be an everyday example of doing this that you guys can think
of? Somebody making up a new advertising campaign for a product.
And so they're using their concrete experiences and I guess abstracting out from that as well, and then sort of using some sort of creative process to
then frame symbols that create experiences in other people.
That provoke actions which they find desirable. The advertisers, that is.
There's probably
would turning on my computer turning on my computer be imaginal? That I know intellectually to use my computer I have to turn it on, and actually pressing the button is bridging between the abstract and the...
No, I would say it's more like what you're imagining that you're going to do on the computer after you've turned it on.
That seems more procedural than participatory. Right, so it seems like the imaginal interacts in the participatory sense, as opposed to knowing to turn your computer on is procedural knowledge.
But you just described, sure, no, I understand that sounds right, but you just described it as imagining what you're going to do. That doesn't seem to bridge the concrete. That's just in the mind. It needs to be at that point of connectedness between the subject, the abstract, and the concrete.
Yeah, it's the creative. It's like where Thomas Edison invented the light bulb. It's taking the idea and putting it into practice, and then living off of it, and embracing that way of living, of seeking out those new, the moreness that is available within the imaginal.
So then, would a way in I don't know if this quite works, but like you could say an imaginary thing would be like a perpetual motion machine. And while we might like try to design theory or like the invention of it, it won't ever be able to take its concrete form because it's like restrictions of the laws of physics. But for things like light bulbs, we can imagine it and create it. And that's why it's within the imaginal domain.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's more or less right. I don't know. Like, I agree with Nick. I think that Vervaeke is explicitly trying to get away from like the meaning what we're talking about by comparing it to imagination. It's not
okay.
Yeah, that's not helpful.
I just pulled up a website that said, imaginal things, on the other hand, are useful ideas you create to comprehend the world and other people. Similes and metaphors are imaginal devices that can help you compare something real to something unrelated. For existence, my employee acts like a skittish horse, or I give her a new chore, or my manager's anger is like a whirlwind.
Okay, so like, well, while you might have the subjective and the objective, where you can have, say, metaphors that only work within the subjective, and those might be more, and then you can have symbols which are also work in the objective and across, I guess, the transjective with other people. And those are the things that are symbolic in that they point you towards something else in a way
Sure,
that's
I just found an article by Henry Corbin about the
Yeah,
imagery.
well, I think
Go
that's right, John, because like Thomas Edison didn't know what electrons are exactly. His interface, like the light bulb, is kind of an interface where you don't have a perfect idea of what you're working with, but it's good enough in it, and it allows you to actually harness what you are working with in a productive fashion.
Right. Yeah, that works quite well with symbols and metaphors.
Yeah, and it affords creation.
Yeah.
And it so it's like that whole narrative of getting yourself in tune with the creative, with your own creativity, with your own creative force or essence or life force.
Right, and that
we
works
are
well.
Meaning makers who make meaning makers.
Yeah, and that connects well with our earlier discussion on transformation. That like symbols have the like if a symbol has this transformative quality to it or aspect that allows for transformation, then this is an indication that the symbol is more or less accurate, I guess, in some sense, or more or less relevant. That would probably be the better description to it.
Probably more consistent with Vervaeke himself.
Mundus imaginalis, na koja abad, or the eighth climate. Some spooky stuff. I noticed it's on the Swedenborg Foundation. All I know about Swedenborg is these sort of a I don't know. He's very much, I guess, connected with the occult and like trying to connect all the religions into one coherent framework or something sort of like that.
Beginnings of the New Age.
Yeah, I'm not. I hadn't heard of Corbin at all prior to Vervaeke. So this is like, is he like some sort of like historical psychologist or something, trying to discern like Heidegger and make better sense out of all of these aspects of human psychology?
Henry Corbin?
Yeah, I'm not sure like what his
seemed to be an expert on Persian Sufism is what he described.
So he's sort of like Jung, I guess, in that
so let me just pull out a quote from this article. So I'll just skip to where, not having read the article, we'll try to zero into the thing we're talking about. So to these three universes correspond three organs of knowledge: the senses, the imagination, and the intellect. A triad to which corresponds the triad of anthropology: body, soul, spirit. A triad that regulates the triple growth of man, extending from this world to the resurrections in the other worlds. We observe immediately that we are no longer reduced to the dilemma of thought and extension, the schema of cosmology and gnoseology, limited to the empirical world and the world of the abstract understanding. Between the two is placed an intermediate world, which our authors designate as the world of the image, mundus imaginalis. A world as ontologically real as the world of the senses and the world of the intellect. A world that requires a faculty of perception belonging to it, a faculty that is a cognitive function, a noetic value, as fully real as the faculties of sensory perception and intellectual intuition. The faculty is the imaginative power, the one we must avoid confusing with the imagination that modern man identifies with fantasy, and that, according to him, produces only the imaginary. Here we are then simultaneously at the heart of our research in the problem of terminology.
So they're very much like, I guess, the psychotechnologies, then, you could say. The thing that we see through, or how did Vervaeke say it? Like, we look at it and we look through it. That's what the symbols are. And like, that's what a psychotechnology is, because it doesn't exist purely subjectively because it's referring to something outside the subjective, but it doesn't exist quite objectively because it's what we're using to see the objective. So that's where it exists, I guess, transjectively. All right. Do we want to wrap up, I guess, on the divine double, or the self and the optimal self, or how do the ideal self, I guess, brought in?
Joel business that he brought in from Corbin.
Well, I was sort of connecting that. I guess, I don't know. It seems like there is quite a bit of overlap between Corbin and Jung. Just like even what you read there, I was reminded, and maybe it's just because I'm more familiar with Jung, having read one or two of his books and other stuff from Peterson. That I kind of see that, like, I know for Jung there's the what is it, the capital S self, in which we are sort of moving towards, and that's kind of where I was kind of seeing that connection with the non-logical identity shared between my 5-year-old self and my 23-year-old self. There's very little identical or sameness between us, but there is still some sort of connection there. And I think Jung, and I guess Corbin, and perhaps Vervaeke are pointing out that, similar to that, there is this higher conception of the self that does not yet exist, but to which we have this similar relationship, in that we're not identical with it. It's not just this true nature within us. Like, that's what he was kind of bringing in with, like, was it Rousseau or some of those that say that we have a nature within us that we're born with, and then to live authentically is to express that nature. But rather, there is this sort of component of transformation that we can undergo to reach that more ideal self. But we share some sort of non-logical identity with that self.
The divine double seems to be our aspiration. Sorry, Nick, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, and even right with Freud, the superego in some sense, or at least like a personified version of the superego.
Well, I think with Freud, the superego is like the image of society that is indwelt or inbuilt within us. So, like, you might have this conception of say if you know it's wrong to steal, then any sort of aspect of guilt or conscience when you think about stealing, that would be an aspect of the superego.
So the superego would almost be like the tool that is guiding us towards the future self that we want to be.
I think within Freud, all three of these components exist
Freud
at the same time. Yeah. Whereas with Jung, the self is something, I guess, in a way external to ourselves, but in I guess this ideal transjective sort of way. I don't know exactly where
the
Jung
ideal image. I guess I guess I would wonder where Freud would place the idealized image of the self. Is that an egoic structure or a superegoic structure? But yeah, that's off the topic. I'm sliding away.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So divine double, I guess an interesting point here is that it's interesting that he in some way seems to support this vision. Correct me if I'm wrong. What I got from Vervaeke was that he was down with the divine double.
Yeah.
But it seems interesting because it seems like the same class of error of making a being out of God.
Well, I would say probably
he likes it as a symbol.
I think that's kind of what it is, like existing as this sort of, I guess, metaphorical tool or psychotechnology or way in which we can go about existence, but not necessarily some sort of like Platonic form of the ideal self that we can become.
Yeah, like he links it to aspiration, and he says rationality means any systematically reliable internalized psychotechnology that reliably and systematically affords you overcoming self-deception. Now he adds here, I think, and affords you cultivating enhanced connectiveness and enhanced meaning in life. So I think this last part he just added to rationality, that rationality means cultivating your enhanced connectiveness and enhanced meaning of life. And this divine double is about enhancing your meaning of life and connectedness.
That whole bit, like it's a euphemism for real.
That last like few sentences or whatever when he was talking about the divine double is confusing, because he was directly relating it to how the version of yourself at 3 years old and the version of yourself now, that very much like puts into the mind like an ontological basis to sort of these two selves that are there. And so if he's saying that there is the you that you are now, and then there's the ideal self, it almost seems like there's got to be some sort of ontological basis to that as well, rather than just transjective like a symbol. Like I'm not just a symbol of my own my 3-year-old self. I'm an actual physical concrete being.
But he have an idea of your future though.
At 3 years old?
But as part of your development, you have to imagine your future, and you are relating to that part of yourself, and that is what forms your divine double.
No, he's pretty clearly not seeing it as a real thing, because he says in one sense divine double is a crazy idea if I see it as part of the two world mythology, but maybe it's not so crazy if I ask why did so many people believe it and what was it doing.
But there I think his reference to the two worlds mythology is the reference to the separation of the world into being and becoming, such that being is this eternal static thing, and he's trying to draw emphasis.
No, I think he means two worlds, meaning the world of like God and the world of and the real.
Yeah,
world.
but Plato explicitly said that the world, the eternal world of being is the real world, and the world of becoming is the illusory world. That's the two worlds mythology, because you're moving from Plato's cave, the illusory world of becoming, to the real world of being. That's the whole narrative. That's where I could link you to other videos where Vervaeke criticizes both Platonic perfectionism and also sorry, I forgot the other.
Nominalism? Yeah. Nominalism? Or Aristotelianism?
Where was it?
What happens when Vervaeke realizes that thinking that it is an ontological reality is part of what makes the psychotechnology work?
Yeah, well, that's exactly. It's like if you the problem with nominalism today is that the elites are forced to be cynical to the very institutions that empower them. Like that's the nihilism crisis.
Well, no, but I think part of what hold on. But isn't part of what he's saying is we can still get the benefit of it even if we don't believe?
It's a claim.
I think he is randomly guessing that might be the case.
Well, I think it's an experiment he's wanting to put into place.
Yeah.
It's a hypothesis.
What he's trying to, like, the other video that he shows is where he's trying to redefine, or he says that he sees being more dynamic and not static. And once you make that move, then everything else that he says starts to make more sense, because he's constantly working against the staticness of the way that language works. And so he's trying to get people to look beyond that static way of being, such that they interact with this divine double with their own future as an opening dynamic growth process that is articulated dynamically and not statically.
Yeah.
And so
I'm very sympathetic to that. What I was in my own words. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, what I was trying to say is that I think with the non-logical identity, that actually kind of makes sense to me in my own way of like interfacing with the world. What I think is that the logical identity, that's sameness. And then like Derrida, for example, who's a postmodernist, he posited differential ontology, which was like an attempt to articulate everything, not in terms of likeness or sameness, but instead in terms of difference. So that
so every definition is relational to something else, right?
Not just that, but the very you with Derrida, you can't even really define things as it is understood commonly, because a definition is a sameness. So he's like, he completely like Derrida basically, if you take him to his if you take him too literally, like you basically get to the position where you can't say anything. And like in many cases you see Derrida, like he spends 10 minutes not saying anything. It's quite funny to watch, actually. where was I going with this?
Yeah, we get to it. I finally, when I get to the 2-hour point, my brain starts to.
Yeah.
Sorry, just refresh my memory.
here.
Why we on Derrida? Sorry, before that.
Differential.
Differential.
Oh yeah.
definition.
Okay. Sorry. So the you got the sameness and you got the difference, and I think the non-logical. Okay. So if I was speaking earlier about the sameness and the change, and the being and the becoming, so the being is the sameness and the becoming is the change. The non-logical identity, I think, is persistence. And so you've got sameness and difference. Those are the two opposites. And you've got change and you've got persistence. And it's the persistence which is the non-logical identity. So
what would be the thing that persists then between my 3-year-old self and my 23-year-old self?
It's precisely your temporality. Like if you think of your persistence as your time, your change as your energy, your sameness as your matter, and then like your difference.
It's a relationship, isn't it? A relationship. Like between,
like I can see that, sort of. Like how the fact that I exist now is contingent, or was contingent upon the fact that I existed 20 years from now. And is that like a way that I can understand what you mean by temporal there?
The way we understand
contingency that goes on.
Well, if the universe didn't have temporality, what would you be? There's an element of you that is temporal. Like you have to be able to speak about that. How do you make sense of that? How does your brain actually work with to structure that information such that you can actually interface with your own idea in a meaningful way? There's
a relational continuity, and I think and it makes sense to talk about it, even though even though no particle in our body is the same as when we were born. It still makes sense to talk about a continuing self.
The way we incorporate the temporality is through narrative, which again makes it very bizarre that he would try and at least overtly throw out narrative.
Right.
It's the thing that's combining the child and the adult.
Exactly. Like you hit the nail on the head. Absolutely. That's just completely my bugbear with Vervaeke there.
Yeah.
It's like we have. Like I realize the narrative is broken, but we can't throw the narrative away. We can't say, well, we're just going to live in a Taoist post-narrative kind of just going with the flow. It's like, no, civilization actually needs to structure itself and look out for the future and structure itself in such a way that people, can actually articulate their goals and for that to be meaningful. Like that interaction. If we don't have that, then yes, everything does feel meaningless because what are we doing?
And the fact that like we have nuclear reactor plants that like if there's no narrative to sort of connect between the two, then there's going to be trouble in the future. Like an actual narrative there. Like I'm referring to the future in a sense.
Yeah, well, that's exactly it's our tool for making sure that we make sure that the reactors don't actually overload or melt down and kill everyone. And
I don't know. I know he comes across as strong in saying that we should do away with narrative, but I don't know. In order to even make sense of all of his other work, it seems like you have to sort of like not take him at his word there.
But
or he's being manipulative accidentally, perhaps.
Yeah, I don't know. Where I checked up on Taoism, the thing is like, yes, there are non-narrative aspects. But the part of Taoism that actually, like, the first part of Taoism, it eschews narrative, but it also says, like, go live as a wandering hermit that doesn't actually involve yourself with human affairs. Then there's the other branch of Taoism, which is actually interested in human affairs, and that is completely purposive. Like, it talks about purpose and using narrative, or not narrative, but using your sense of purpose to actually gain control of the world. And so it's not the kind of Taoism which Vervaeke paints. And so
I think a way in which to be able to make sense of his two conflicting ideas is to ground it, I guess, or like I'm assuming he grounds it within pragmatism purely. That like our narratives have no direct correlation to reality in any sort of sense, and we should get rid of any notion that they do. But they're still very practical to use in order to communicate with other people. And so for that reason, we can use narratives as long as we keep it on I guess, sort of the
Mhm.
symbolic level.
Yeah,
Except
but
that
the
he
question is,
also upended reality. So
yeah, why is the narrative reality? Like that's where it all just
Oh,
goes
yeah.
to pieces.
Like, how does a narrative work if it doesn't have some sort of mapping to reality?
No, the narrative can work without a mapping to reality. But when you create the narrative and say that you construct the narrative so that the narrative tries to map to reality, but then you argue, oh well, there is actually in reality no narrative. Just yeah,
Well, it's
I can't
like his
square
whole
that.
course is geared at promoting narrative, the necessity of narrative, and there's a disconnect between his downplaying narrative at the same time. I haven't solved it yet, and I hopefully, like, even in this lecture,
He's got 2
being very
episodes left to square that
Yeah.
circle.
No, he just seems he just seems to be desperate to get away from fundamentalist literalist narrative.
Yeah.
And then I think he just loses, he gets uncareful with his
It
But I
is
appreciate at least that
probably-
he's like supporting Pajot in his sort of
Yeah.
like re-articulation of symbolism in a way that like people can kind of make sense of now, that I think is like both meaningful to them within their religious traditions, like within Pajot's orthodoxy, but also as a way of just being able to understand your cultural heritage, like kind of like what Peterson does, and being able to kind of like think about the Bible not as this storybook for ignorant goat herders, but rather as this kind of like cultural expression of our psychology over time, and like the persistent ideas that are retained within us. That at least has a much more meaningful approach to narrative. And that's kind of the thing. Like with Peterson, there doesn't have to be any sort of direct correlation between the narratives of the Bible and some sort of historical facts of the matter. I do think, especially with Peterson, that there does have to be some sort of mapping to recurring archetypes of history.
Yeah,
otherwise the narratives wouldn't make any
Peterson's
sense or be
approach now
effective.
is that the Bible is more a psychology book, I think, than a history book. That it's describing human psychology more than.
Well, it's not just psychology, but human
life.
Yeah, exactly. Like there are times when you're going to be the Noah of the story, or you're going to be the Abraham of the story, and when you're in those times, these symbolic representations within the Bible can give you a good sort of like
Rule of thumb
narrative in order to like guide your actions for what to do in those situations.
What to do or not to do, yeah.
All right, we should wrap it up there. That's the thing, like these types of conversations, especially this one, it's almost like doing like a brain workout the whole time, just trying to like fully grasp everything that's going on and be able to like participate in it. So thank you very much, both Nicholas and Brett and Delric, for joining us, and also Craig for joining us as well. This has been a really good conversation. I'm looking forward now to our future ones, and it's coming towards the end. I'm not sure exactly. I do want to, I think I have this idea for sort of a series that, I don't know, I haven't talked too much about it with everybody here, but of this somewhat like a series of sort of discussions on the relation between atheism and Christianity in sort of the modern age, and where those two can, I guess, overlap in certain ways.
Is that Zizek thing that we never got around to actually?
yeah. There's some of that to do with Slavoj Žižek. Yeah, his sort of conception of Christian atheism, which is quite unique and fascinating to himself. But also, I think with Peterson as well. I think there's quite a bit of a following with Peterson, that people that call themselves cultural Christians or Christian atheists. In sort of that same Petersonian style, which I think could be a series of very interesting conversations to have, and I think probably will be quite related to a lot of the stuff that we've dealt with in the past on this channel. So
yeah, that sounds like a lot of fun.
Yeah. All right, so I have all of the links to the people in the description below. I'll have to add your Twitter handle as well, Struan, so don't worry about that. But yeah, thanks everybody for joining us. Have a good night.
Thanks. Take care.